The Galactic Federation has visited innumerable planets and come across innumerable races, each more developed and powerful than the previous Earth, yet it was merely a backwater planet and not a priority. For the warriors from other planets, the region where primitive creatures lived was hardly worth the hassle of formal first contact. They chuckled as they continued to prowl in areas where the supposedly clever species hadn't even mastered space travel. As they neared the planet's surface, they began sharing stories about Earth that almost seemed derogatory to one soldier there, stated in a tone brimming with contempt the last time I looked at their data feeds. "Can you believe people still feel that hunting animals is a viable means of survival?" His friend chuckled. "It's surprising that most of them on our planet reside in trees or in certain stone huts. It's amazing they haven't been destroyed by their own foolishness." Another soldier, more towering and commanding than the others, grinned and said, "It's likely that wildlife is more developed than they are." "Can you imagine having to hunt?" with the group burst out laughing, using instruments rather than just manipulating energy fields. Their sleek silver uniforms shining in the cold light of their ship Earth was only a stepping stone that they were there to evaluate. There were many planets for the Federation to explore and gather information on. Earth was simply the next in line. There was no danger, no difficulty, and there was definitely no joy among their commanders seated at the ship's helm. Stern was staring at the mission parameters that were flashing over the screen, not even bothering to join the debate. Even while he wasn't amused in the same way, he wasn't worried either because Earth was just a low-level blip on the radar, a priority task that would require little work. But he nonetheless made sure his crew was prepared for any possible risks, but improbable as it seemed, protocol was protocol as they went in. The ship's sensors started collecting data on the Earth's atmosphere, including readings from environmental sensors and life-form scans. Evaluations all supporting the notion that Earth is a poor planet with no indications of advanced. The most deadly life forms had civilizations with no energy readings that suggested anything more advanced than primitive technology. Were enormous terrestrial animals, but even they were subdued in comparison to the threats they had seen on other planets. The commander looked over the readings and nodded slightly, saying, "This is standard procedure. I anticipate that this mission will land, secure the perimeter, and start the data collecting." The troops quickly nodded, letting go of their earlier derision and revealing their effective professionalism. They had practiced, so they set up their gear, adjusted their helmets, and examined their weapons, but it was a typical mission, so they were prepared for anything that might come up. When the ship landed in a clearing, the troops got down and scanned the area, using their advanced technology to scan the forest. Sprawled out in front of them was lush and green, yet their readings revealed no threats at all, just sporadic, little life. Though none of the shapes moved in danger, it scarcely seemed worth the. A soldier made an attempt, his voice crackling through the cals after a few quick glances. "Swift report, and we're off. Perhaps we'll get to visit another soldier who is obviously younger and more eager to joke." Several of their fabled hunters, the ones who use sticks to pursue animals, were amused by the concept. They thought it absurd that people on Earth could be anything other than primitive since they had heard tales of human. It was absurd to the hunters how they were supposed to track and kill wild creatures with only simple tools. Warriors whose spouses' weaponry might instantly destroy a monster. Humans were merely creatures battling to survive on a world that hadn't advanced past its primitive state. In the beginning, they easily navigated the woodland with the aid of technology, and the soldiers continued to. Yet, as they progressed, it became evident that they were not taking the assignment seriously. Blame them to them, Earth was the sole planet and never a threat. Their mission was to carry out the Federation's mandate to catalog every planet, no matter how little. As they strolled, their sensors detected anything out of the ordinary. The soldiers paused, interested about the big heat signature not far from their location. But looking at the readings, one of them replied, "Not to worry, looks like we have something big nearby." Probably one of the commander nodded, indicating that you should advance cautiously while maintaining your armaments ready. They advanced toward the heat signature without taking any chances. The younger soldier's footsteps were hushed as the sounds of the woodland floor beneath them were absorbed by their advanced armor. Who had before laughed lifted his weapon eyes and peered at the trees in front of him. The heat signature moved slowly but purposefully. It was big but not quick. The woods split as they got closer to the source, so whatever it wasn't in a rush. The soldiers paused to take in the sight of a big beast that was moving through the underrush, somewhat disclosing it. It was a massive, lumbering bear that showed no signs of awareness of them. The creature was obviously a formidable predator in its own right because it had thick, matted fur covering its body and rippling muscles when it moved. A younger soldier gave a low whistle, which is impressive. But against any of us, that monster wouldn't survive 5 seconds. While the bear moved its senses and tuned in to something in the forest, the others nodded in accord. Disregard for the soldiers to them, it was just another illustration of how resilient but ultimately antiquated Earth's biosphere is. The commander motioned for them to keep going, but the bear wasn't a match for the kind of technology they had. Their worry, since they needed to gather information, and the monster posed no threat. Walked by the bear while using their equipment to film every aspect of the surrounding environment, the dense woodland, however. Since it was simple for them to traverse, each stride they took confirmed that Earth was what they had imagined. Was undeveloped, unsophisticated, and eventually unimportant as they went on. As they moved farther into the forest, their quiet scanning device hum replaced their earlier laughter and jokes, tasked to perform, and the sooner it was finished, the sooner they could depart Earth, as they had nothing more to give them than the information. As long as the hunter moved, they had to gather, and none of them had any reason to think differently. With ease, his footsteps soundless on the thick blanket of leaves underneath him, having spent years in the dark forest honing his art and becoming an expert on every aspect of the wilderness he called home, he could read the entire story each rustling leaf and fallen branch told. His life's work, his breath was steady, and his eyes were fixed on the trail. Going forward, just like he had been tracking the bear for so many days before to going hunting, it was a big one, stronger than most of the music he'd heard for hours. The paw prints' size, their imprint in the earth, and their meandering paths all contributed to this. Bear had experience, but so did he. He was familiar with its routines and route. Before they met, the woodland was eventually filled with the sounds of nature. The hunter recognized the sounds of the birds calling from the treetops and the wind whispering through the branches, and consoling, but they also served as indicators, letting him know where his target may be. The distance it had covered, and if it had noticed him so far, everything was in order. He adjusted his rifle strap, its weight serving as a continuous reminder of the work at hand. The weapon wasn't brand new, but like anything he utilized, it was dependable. Lacked the need for expensive gear or cutting-edge technology he could see with his hands. And the rifle was only a tool, an extension of his intuition, all he required. Despite having the ability to hunt both with and without it, he decided to bring it along today. This wasn't a decision based only on due to necessity, but the hunter stopped, crouched close to the ground out of respect for the animal he was hunting. Re-examined the tracks, which were still fresh, because the bear had only been through this area an hour before. Looked around the trees in the area for any indication of activity, but he didn't see anything yet. Even though he could feel it in his bones, he stood gingerly, taking care not to disturb the surrounding woodland. His best ally in a skilled hunter was patience, so there was no need to rush anything. Never rushed. Never forced a confrontation before the appropriate moment, for eventually the bear would make a mistake, and when it did, he would be prepared as he moved forward, and his thoughts turned to the things he had discovered throughout the years that his father had been the one to instruct him. Demonstrating to him how to trace through the forest without being detected or heard despite his modest demeanor, the hunter felt the weight of every word his father stated. Had gained more knowledge about the land his father had informed him about from those few words than from anything else in his life. Respect animals, they are more than just objects of worship, they are a part of this universe. As long as you treat them nicely, they'll impart more knowledge to you than any man could. He had kept those words with him, using them to guide him on every trip. He didn't hunt for fun or the rush of the kill. The forest served as his home, and he hunted since it was what he knew how to do. His neighbors' hunts of animals served as a test of his prowess and a means of demonstrating that the hunter halted once more, this time at the place where he still felt like he belonged and understood the natural order. He could see the telltale indications of a recent passage at the edge of a small clearing where the tracks led was shining straight through. Shattered branches, jumbled leaves, and a little bear odor permeated the atmosphere. He ducked down again, studying the area where the clearing was, his eyes narrowing. With its back to us, the bear would not stay here for long. Instead, it would walk swiftly by the protection of the trees to carry on with its journey. The hunter was aware of the route it would follow. The bear would probably pause to drink in the stream. Just past the clearing, it was the ideal location for an ambush. The hunter circled, content to take his time and utilize it carefully. His movements were unhurried as he moved toward the creek, staying inside the shade of the trees. Thoughtfully, placing each foot so as not to create any noise when the wind changed. Carrying a faint bear scent in his direction that was far closer than he had anticipated, he stopped once more and listened to the trees. Where there was a faint rustling sound. But it was obvious that the bear was ahead, just although it hadn't yet noticed him and hadn't detected his scent. Over the next ridge he was still. Taking charge of the pursuit, he advanced with his rifle ready in the underbrush. Thickened as he got closer to the ridge, yet he easily made his way through it, moving in harmony with everything around him. Was more acutely aware of his surroundings, and the bear and him became the only two in the world. When he arrived at the top of the ridge, he saw the enormous bear even bigger than he had envisioned it, standing at the stream's bank, its head lowered as it lapped at the water, its dark, thick fur muscles the strong animal had washed up beneath the surface. Spent a long time living in the forest, and the hunter stopped to admire the creature's might and beauty. He sought out these moments because he felt a connection to nature that few others could. Realized that the bear was not just his prey but also, in many respects, an equal. Were both talented individuals who had survived, he lifted his firearm. With his finger barely pressing the trigger, he paused before firing. Observing the bear's motions and analyzing its behavior, he had to be sure he chose the ideal time to fire a shot that would swiftly put an end to the chase, and with precision, there was no space for error as the bear raised its head to sniff the air. Had not seen him, but it knew something was wrong. The hunter stayed motionless, his breathing steady and his heart rate constant. Manipulated the bear's eyes to scan the surroundings, but it remained still and was wary. But the hunter remained unfrightened, waiting a little more, his focus remaining unwavering as the bear shifted slightly to avoid the stream, and as he pulled the trigger, a shot was fired that reverberated throughout the trees. Startled and taken by surprise by the sudden impact, the bear let out a deep growl that turned to face the sound, but it was too late. When the bear fell close to the stream's edge, the hunter's shot was accurate, but the bear's body remained in the forest. Went silent once more, the natural sounds gradually returning as though nothing had occurred, and the hunter dropped his weapon. He moved forward to approach the bear, crouched down next to it, and touched its thick fur. The quest was done. Prosperous as he had anticipated, yet as he stood there and peered down at the animal was overcome with an odd feeling of dread because something had altered the woodland. The soldiers resumed their steady march into the woodland, feeling strange even though it was familiar. The equipment was quietly humming as it collected data from the surroundings, but their confidence was unwavering because they had. The fact that Earth was a primitive planet and its creatures might be enormous, but they lacked the technology and intellect to really threaten anyone. Thus the younger soldier was still entertained by the mission's simplicity. He looked at the measurements on his arm panel and saw that the heat signal signature was ahead. Thus, it's most likely the commander remained silent, staring intently at the data that was running across his visor. It was all just another animal. Routine as anticipated, the scanners had not found any cutting-edge technology. Sensitive organisms that might match their powers. They would finish their task and go, maybe with it as they neared the location where the tree's heat signature was strongest. They had a few entertaining tales to share with the others. Narrowed somewhat to show a little area in the middle where a rough-looking man stood. He had a rifle different from the ones the troops had, and it was worn and utterly out of place next to them. The soldiers paused and were momentarily taken aback when they saw something that appeared more like an antique than a weapon in years. It was an uncommon sight to see people this far into the bush, given the unexpected sight. The man didn't appear to notice them at first, even on a world like Earth. He was at ease since his focus was on something else, someplace far away. Completely concentrated, oblivious to the men behind him, one of the soldiers smirking glance at this man, who appears to be hunting, and with an antique gun, as the others quietly giggled as they observed the man, their reactions a mixture of surprise and shock at this human being. They had no purpose and were only a remnant, a symbol of Earth's backwardness. Although he had no bearing on their objective, the commander raised a hand to speak with him. His eyes furrowed as he observed the man observing the path, gesturing for stillness. When he moved, there was something about him that was distinct from their preconceived notions of him as a savage. He was so serene that the commander was at a loss for words, but his gut told him to proceed with caution and not to approach the commander, but his voice firm but quiet, asking whether he knew anything about the region the troops advanced, their rifles down but ready, and approached the man with cautious, methodical strides. The man continued to appear oblivious to them as they crunched softly on the woodland floor. Was looking at something completely different, his eyes sweeping the clearing's edge. As one of the troops stepped, he leaned closer, mockingly saying, "Hey, old man, you lost out here and need some help." The man held his rifle with his eyes forward and didn't reply. Slowly, the troops looked at each other, perplexed by his lack of response. We're accustomed to people being either startled or stunned by their presence, but this individual appeared unaffected by it. The soldier spoke again, this time with more volume, as though they weren't even there. "What are you doing outside when we're talking to you?" The man's head twitched. Just enough to let them know they were there, but his demeanor was neutral. He didn't appear afraid or astonished, just realized, "I'm hunting," he stated in a hushed, harsh voice. The thought of this man with his antiquated rifle and rudimentary, they found anything significant that seemed like a joke, but the commander wasn't laughing. Instead, he was observing the man intently, noting how he positioned himself and how he carried his weapon. This was no typical human hunting. The younger soldier inquired while maintaining a smile, "Rabbits and squirrels?" After a moment, the man didn't answer and instead shifted his attention back to the trees, his gaze slightly narrowing as though he was listening for something. Soldiers became obviously disinterested as they grew irritated and agitated with his silence. They decided that this individual wasn't worth their time, but before they could go, the surrounding woodland appeared to change. There was a low rumbling sound in the distance, and it got louder every second. The troops automatically clenched their hands and advanced toward their weapons. "What's that?" one of them inquired. Looking around, the man didn't respond. Instead, he gently elevated his weapon. Body motionless, the soldiers stared after him, their sensors detecting motion up ahead. Something substantial was approaching. The heat signature, which was larger than what they had previously observed in Ed, wasn't just an animal. The earth trembled slightly as the enormous, lumbering beast, a bear, came into view. It was far larger than expected. Its fur was thick and matted, and its eyes were flaming with a ferocious primal fury that was unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen. The warriors paused in shock at the horrifying power with which it moved, its muscles rippling beneath their skin. Technology and training had not prepared them for this. The bear was an uncontrollable force of nature. The younger soldier, who had just been giggling, raised his rifle rapidly, saying, "We've got it under control," he murmured in a trembling voice. Like a bear, firing, the energy beam from the bear was struck solidly in the chest by his weapon. Yet the bear did not stop it. With an incredible speed, the boom of thunder struck the woods as it rushed ahead. The troops attempted to subdue the beast by dispersing their guns and firing quickly, but the bear was constantly slamming through their ranks. Its huge form caused one soldier to be pushed aside, his armor crumpling under the creature's weight. The man, who was still standing in the clearing, calmly observed the mayhem that was happening all around him. He just stood there, waiting, not firing his rifle, his eyes trailing. The troops panicked at bear's movements and kept firing, but their weapons appeared to have little impact. One soldier was too close to the bear and moving too quickly. One was flung into a tree, crumpling under the impact, and the other was swung to the ground. The commander let his rifle fly out of his hands and yelled, slicing through the mayhem and gathering the surviving soldiers, who fumbled to comply their frenzied motions. The bear attacked them after detecting their fear, enormous jaws cracking inches from the commander's face, and then the man moved as abruptly as it had started. With careful aim, he raised his weapon and let out a single cry. A loud snap that reverberated across the forest. The bear stumbled and a large gash opened in its side. Releasing a last enraged roar, gave way to a limp body as the injured and broken warriors stared in disbelief. The man moved forward, his visage impassive, and approached the fallen with his rifle lowered. Bear crouched next to it, his hand resting on its fur, and remained silent. To observe the troops observing him, their disbelief on their expressions apparent to him. They were unimportant. The search was the commander, who was still gasping for air. Tentatively moved to meet, his eyes flipped back and forth between the man and the deceased bear as he attempted to comprehend what had just occurred. "You had killed it." The commander spoke quietly. And when the man didn't glance up, it was time for him to respond. The soldiers just stood there, frozen in amazement, as their shock gradually gave way to a deeper seeing that this man, armed only with a crude rifle, had defeated all of their advanced weaponry, armor, and strategies had been defeated by a single blow. Failed where his accuracy and instinct had succeeded. They looked at each other. With a look of incredulity in their eyes, the younger soldier continued to tend to the bruise caused by the bear's toss. Couldn't remain silent any longer, shaking his head in a mute way. He couldn't have accomplished that. Luck must have had a role. Yet even as he stated the words, that he knew they weren't genuine luck. but they didn't explain the hunter's movements for the composed precision. Which the hunter had behaved, he hadn't hesitated, he hadn't been scared, and he had known exactly what to do, and he had succeeded in doing so. The commander was still observing as the hunter cautiously advanced and inquired in a quiet, but firmly, "How did you accomplish that?" The man stood and carefully wiped his hands on his worn pants. He faced the warriors with steady, calm eyes that said nothing about, as he put it plainly, "It's about recognizing when the solution is too easy to accept." Precise. But the commander felt there was more to it. The hunter's gaze revealed a level of comprehension that beyond he hadn't simply killed the bear, he had foreseen every move it would make, beyond anything the men had ever encountered. Taken charge of the situation as soon as the beast emerged. With the younger soldier still furious and pointing at the man, "You not even equipped with modern technology. That firearm is outdated. How can you?" The commander interrupted him with a scathing gesture, saying, "This man," just the younger soldier bit his tongue to save us. But his eyes were filled with frustration. He still believed that everything about this event was incorrect, and that there were, despite having the technology, armor, and weapons necessary to be the superior force. The commander looked back to the group, realizing that they had been the ones fighting for survival while this human was in charge. "The hunter has been following this bear for quite some time, don't you think?" Nodded. "It's your responsibility to become familiar with their routines and habits. If you know what to look for, you can forecast them." The warriors listened, and their perplexity gradually transformed into something else more respectful. Even though none of them would say it aloud, it was evident that this person, whom they had written off as primitive, has the knowledge and skills they undervalued. While he lacked their technology, he possessed other capabilities they were just getting started with. The commander motioned for the bear's big body to be understood. The hunter shrugged slightly. "We thought we could handle it with our weapons, but we failed. Like, the solution is simple. You rely too much on your tech, which bear doesn't seem to care about. When it's trapped, it fights because it worries about survival, not about your weaponry. Back with everything it possessed, you handled it like an inexperienced person and didn't know how to read it or predict its next move." The remarks hung in the air in sharp contrast, treating the opponent like an animal. Considering the soldiers' prior presumptions, they had been taught to view any obstacle as one that could be superior firepower. But this man, this hunter, had come up to the circumstance with a distinct perspective to him. The bear wasn't merely a threat. It was a live thing with understandable instincts and predictable behaviors. "Ed," the younger soldier scoffed, "you're saying that we should have just watched it and let it do whatever it did because he was unable to contain his annoyance any longer?" The hunter nodded. "No, you have to act, but you have to act with when you approached the bear. It was defending itself, not trying to harm you, with hostility, to which it reacted with violence. I knew when to attack because I could tell when it would err." The commander listened carefully, thinking over what the hunter had said. In his thoughts was accurate when he stated that the Federation has always taken a dominant stance, imposing its will on anyone. Nonetheless, that strategy had not worked here on Earth, as the bear had been a force of nature, something outside of their control, and the man standing was the only one who had a true understanding of that. The commander finally spoke to them again after a lengthy pause, saying, "We misjudged you." He stated clearly, "We believed that Earth was a primitive place and that you were just like the animals we scanned. However, you've shown us incorrect." The hunter didn't answer right away. Instead, he only examined the men as though considering his answer before nodding a little. "You are not alone in making that error." The remarks were not intended to be critical, but they nevertheless hurt. Soldiers who had previously been so certain of their dominance were now forced to doubt all of their presumptions concerning this planet and its people. The commander moved to be nearer to the hunter and spoke in a more courteous manner. The hunter inclined his head slightly as he thought about what more he didn't know about Earth. When asked if Earth is a difficult place, he finally responded, "It's not just the animals, it's you cannot just come here and expect to manage the land, the weather, or the way everything functions. You must learn to live with it, otherwise you've seen what occurs." The commander nodded slowly, his admiration for the man building with every moment. This was his viewpoint. Never came across previously, one that contradicted all he had learned on other planets. The Federation's though technology had always been sufficient, the younger soldier still needed something deeper here on Earth. Shaking his head in frustration, he thought, "But we're supposed to be the best we can be, presumably boasting the most cutting-edge technology in the galaxy. How is this location any different?" The hunter encountered his serene look, realizing that it's not about being the best, but rather understanding where technology, as you currently use it, can only carry you so far. After that, it's all about survival, and that doesn't always mean having the biggest gun sometimes. It's more about understanding. The soldiers were trained to think about the environment around them, so the remarks touched them more deeply than they would have liked to acknowledge. They saw themselves as the pinnacle of galactic evolution, unbeatable, but on this globe they had been defeated by a self-sufficient guy who relied only on his intuition and comprehension. Of the commander inhaled deeply as he realized how humble the land was. Eyes never leaving the hunter, he muttered, "We have a lot to learn about Earth and about ourselves." The hunter nodded slightly, as though he had heard those words already. "Everything out. But you have to be open to listening. This planet will test and push you regardless of how advanced you are." And the commander now realized that if you're not careful, it will break you. It wasn't simply about weaponry or technology. It was about something more profound. The hunter's survival on Earth was not due to his superior abilities, as the Federation had disregarded in their pursuit of control. Instruments. But since he was aware of its regulations, the soldiers stood motionless. Bears encircling Fallen recognized that their purpose had shifted. They had arrived on Earth with the intention of dominating and imposing rather than their will. They had learned a lesson that they would not soon forget. The commander stood, taking in the words of the hunter, while his soldiers stayed silent, feeling the weight of their defeat. Eventually dawning on them like a thick cloud, the understanding that they had miscalculated this planet's population. The expedition wasn't proceeding as planned, but now that they had been humbled, pride had no place. "Pack up," the leader directed the men to obey, gathering in a steady but gentler voice than before. The hunter watched them, their equipment devoid of its customary quips and haughtiness, leaving no space for laughter. His look was opaque. He wasn't taking pleasure in their suffering or gloating. He just remained there, acting as if this moment, like all the others in his life, was a part of the natural flow of events. The younger soldier, still adjusting to the reality of their circumstances, took one final look at the bear before turning. "What are you going to do now, hunter?" The man didn't think twice. Taking care of, he told him straight out that the bear's death wasn't just something that needed to be taken care of. The hunt's end was part of a bigger cycle, and he appreciated it for that reason. Completely comprehended. "Is this how you live?" The commander inquired in a more tone with greater curiosity than previously in daily exposure to such risks. The hunter nodding. "You have to learn to deal with life here if you want to survive. It's about doing what needs to be done in the land, not about wanting to put yourself in risk. Has regulations that you must abide by or else you risk being ignored." The soldiers pay attention cautiously, no longer writing off his remarks as the babblings of a caveman. There was something about the manner he spoke with a gentle wisdom they had never experienced on other worlds. Had witnessed many more sophisticated species and societies, but none of them possessed this comprehension of their environment on Earth, where the laws were different. The commander moved to confront the hunter, who was only a few feet away. He had questions, but he was wise enough not to bombard the man with them. Instead, he focused on the ones that really mattered. Most of all, he never expected to pose a question like, "What should we do now?" Human, but the day's events had changed everything, therefore they required direction. Something their technology was unable to deliver. The hunter gave the question some thought before speaking with you. "Go return to where you came from, leave this area. And consider what you've seen. Earth isn't something you can control. The lesson that you, the commander, must understand is that although you can conquer it, you will never be its owner." Slowly nodded. It was counsel he never would have taken, but now he understood. Earth was a world that defied their assumptions, and the inhabitants here, yet, felt that it was the only path forward. The hunter inquired, "Will others come?" Simple as they appeared, they were far more complex than they had given them credit for. With a steady stare, the commander considered the possibility that more of your sort. Federation typically doesn't abandon projects, but in this case they'll consider before sending anyone back here without thorough planning. I did that twice, and the hunter didn't seem shocked. Assume that if and when they arrive, they will encounter the identical situation. As you did this, nobody's perception of land changes. And the commander saw the seriousness of the situation. Earth wasn't simply another world to record and leave behind, was one that required deference and a location that, if overpressed, would retaliate in its inhabitants. Regardless of how little or unimportant they might appear, he now turned to his men as part of the fight on a galactic scale. Completely packed, they were weary, injured but not broken, and they were waiting for his orders. They had barely lived, but they had learnt their lesson. "Will let you know how," with a firm and clear voice. The commander declared, "We'll tell them exactly what we've learned here on this planet." Not as we had assumed, the soldiers' silent saying volumes were conveyed by their nods. As they was ready to leave the younger soldier still, they realized they had seen enough and didn't need any more persuasion. I'm not sure why the hunter was contacted one last time while dealing with the day's events. Silently, he acknowledged, "You don't have any of the things we do with technology. How do you survive here without armor or weapons like ours?" The hunter asked him. Before responding, "I thought for a long time, since I know what it takes, it's not about the tools, it's about understanding your place in the earth." The younger generation learns from their experiences rather than fighting the land. Soldier nodded, although he was still not quite sure that he understood that he had lived his whole life depending on technology for being a part of a system that, although it had been disproved here on Earth, thought it could control everything. The commander moved forward and said, simply put, "Thank you," in a respectful tone. Was all he had to give, but it was more significant than any of them had realized when they initially arrived. The hunter nodded in return, saying in a calm voice, "Safe travels." He didn't ask for anything in exchange. I didn't anticipate any lavish displays. It was just another day. Another turning point in the troops' protracted cycle of survival occurred in his life. And although their steps were heavier now than when they had arrived on Earth as conquerors, they made their way back to the spacecraft. Were departing as students, the surrounding woodland appeared to have gone past the commotion and become quieter. Of the day, the commander cast a final look in the direction of the fallen bear and noticed the hunter's silhouette. He wouldn't soon forget seeing the ship merge into the foliage. Took off, the soldiers all fell silent, engrossed in thought. The commander's thoughts were altered by the comments of the hunter as he considered the day's happenings. Earth and its inhabitants were neither backward or primitive. Rather, this world was just different, and when they pierced Earth's atmosphere, that difference was something to be recognized. At last, the commander said, "We'll need a new report." The soldiers sidestepped. "Curious, we'll report what we observed to the Federation, but we'll also let them know this. Although Earth isn't a threat, we would be gravely mistaken if we treated it as one." The younger soldier nodded slowly as we left, still processing everything. The commander answered, "We've seen what we needed to see. Earth, leaving them alone for now, can manage itself." As the spacecraft shot into orbit, the captain gave a quiet promise that he would see to it that the Federation was aware of Earth's actual nature. As a globe that required respect, and if they were smart, they would, rather than as a planet to be subjugated or subdued. Pay attention to that lesson before it's too late. The vastness of the galaxy is waiting for them, but the stars. The commander realized that behind them lay a planet, unlike any they had ever met.